Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, so today we're going to dig into something pretty wild about one of history's most influential thinkers. What if Sigmund Freud's most famous ideas were shaped by a hidden force he saw everywhere but couldn't actually name?
All right, let's just jump right in with a thought experiment, because this really gets to the heart of our whole story. It's a question that's going to ask us to rethink the very foundations of psychoanalysis.
So picture this. You've got this brilliant theorist, right? He's in a big, bustling city. But this city has a huge problem. There's this pathogen going around that literally destroys people's brains. He sees the devastating effects in his patients, he even writes it down. And then he builds his entire system of thought on a completely different foundation.
And here's the kicker. This isn't just some made-up story. It's not a thought experiment at all. This is exactly what happened with Sigmund Freud in Vienna. The pathogen? It was syphilis.
Okay, to really get this, we've got to go back in time. We need to understand the world that gave birth to psychoanalysis, fin de siècle Vienna. You know, it was this incredible hub of art and ideas, but underneath all that glamour, it was hiding a really dark and very widespread medical secret.
Yeah, see, back then, public health was basically dominated by what one historian calls this savage trinity of diseases. But while you could talk about TB or alcoholism, syphilis, well, that was a whole other story. It was trapped in this moral maze of shame and total enforced silence.
And I mean, it is so hard to overstate how intense that silence was. Just listen to this quote from a major medical journal at the time. It was literally considered a bigger social crime to talk about syphilis than it was to actually get it. The silencing was absolutely total and completely deliberate.
And believe me, there were real consequences for breaking that taboo. Get this, a popular women's magazine tried to publish some articles to educate its readers, and its circulation dropped by 75,000 overnight. The message could not have been clearer. You do not talk about this.
So, okay, let's bring this back to Freud's clinic. How did this culture of silence create what was essentially a diagnostic darkroom? How did it make it almost impossible to see what was really going on with his patients?
Well, here's the thing. Syphilis was famously known as the Great Mimic. Why? Because in its later stages, when it attacks the brain, the symptoms looked exactly like the stuff Freud was treating. We're talking anxiety, paranoia, sexual issues. All the hallmarks of what he called psychoneurosis were also the hallmarks of a brain infection.
And this is where the timeline becomes absolutely critical. Look at when Freud published his biggest foundational works. All of them came out before 1906. Now, why is that year so important? Because that's the year the very first reliable biological test for syphilis was invented.
You see what this means, right? He was basically theorizing in the dark. He had no way to tell the difference between psychological repression and a neurological infection. He'd see this behavior rooted in sexual conflict and shame, and he'd put a psychological label on it. He couldn't possibly know how often he was just looking at the early signs of a brain disease.
But hold on, that's only half the story. And this next part is maybe even more remarkable. Because buried in his own writing, it turns out Freud saw the signal. He wasn't completely in the dark after all.
Okay, listen to this. In one of his most famous books, published just 1 year before that test came out, Freud makes this absolutely astonishing disclosure. He's flat out stating that in more than half of his most severe cases, the patient's father had syphilis. And he says himself that this connection is significant.
I mean, just let that sink in for a second. The majority of his toughest cases, the very patients who helped him build his theories, had this direct, known link to a brain-altering disease. This isn't some footnote. It's a potential bombshell right in the middle of his data.
And that brings us to the central mystery of this whole story. Why? Why would he see this biological signal, admit it's important, and then just build his entire theoretical castle somewhere else entirely?
So you know what we have to do. We have to go back and look at his biggest ideas, but this time through the lens of this hidden epidemic. Let's start with the big one, libido. For Freud, this was everything. He said this psychic energy, this sexual drive, was the engine behind our entire mental lives, from creating beautiful art to developing a neurosis. But what if it's not some universal human force? Think about it. If you're a doctor in a city where sex is literally, biologically, devastatingly consequential, where it's destroying minds and families left and right, isn't it kind of logical to conclude that sexuality is the root of all psychological problems? So the real question is, Did he mistake a local pathological crisis for a universal truth about all of us?
Okay, next up, the unconscious. You know, that deep, dark reservoir of feelings and memories that supposedly drives all the stuff we do without knowing why.
But what if the unconscious was really, at least in part, just a name for something else? A name for the bizarre effects of a brain infection that nobody could test for and nobody was allowed to talk about. I mean, a syphilis infection in the brain would cause exactly the kinds of things he blamed on the unconscious: sudden personality changes, alien impulses, actions that contradict a person's values. Was he basically describing the symptoms of a disease, but using the language of the psyche?
So, wow, where does all this leave us? How are we supposed to think about Freud's monumental legacy now?
Look, the point here isn't to say Freud was a charlatan or that he got everything wrong. Absolutely not. If anything, it makes him seem even more brilliant. A pioneering scientist working in what we now know was a massively confusing research environment. And let's be clear, he got so much right, especially the power of the talking cure. That's proven itself over and over.
So, the real issue, the core problem, was one of universalization. He was looking at a very specific group of people, a population whose minds were being warped by a specific disease in a specific place and time, and he built a theory about all people for all time based on what he saw.
And that leaves us with one last, kind of challenging question. Freud saw the signal of a physical disease. He even wrote it down. And then he built his world-changing theories somewhere else. So it really makes you wonder, what are the unseen signals shaping our own big ideas today? What's the invisible disease, the cultural taboo? What's the pox in our room?